the incoming students this year have been going through a guided discussion on the theme of claiming the classical, and we move straight past the question of whether ancient Greece and Rome are relevant today, because they are, and we move straight to the more interesting questions of how are they relevant, and secondly, why are they relevant? So I'm going to apply those questions to the medium of digital games, and that includes what we call video games and computer games. But it's actually a very long story that's continuing to expand into new formats and new media, new platforms, the types of technology. We haven't even reached half a century, and already digital games have gone from something that was a lab experiment, a kind of something to tinker with. Even the great Tetris was an experiment to a sort of a toy to test a piece of hardware. And it's gone from there into, first it went into bars, and then it went into designated arcades, and then it started to get into people's houses. Computers became domestic tools, and then there were consoles that hooked up to your TV, and you could play games through that. And they continued to expand into handheld devices, and now we have, of course, digital games on smartphones. So before you continue listening, I just want you to do something. I'm going to ask for a show of hands. And I just want to find out, how many of you would say that you've never played any kind of digital game? Okay, let the record show there are no hands. How many of you have played any kind of digital game within the past month? I think that's almost everybody. Almost everybody. Okay, that's about what I expected, certainly 90%. So what I'm going to do today is to look at a few examples of digital games. I'm going to try and cover different eras in the history of the medium. I'm going to cover different places around the world these come from, and I'm also going to cover different genres, styles of game, which have now become well established, and I'm going to cover at least 3 of those. And I'm going to ask, first of all, why are these games making use of ancient Greek and Roman history, culture, literature, art, myth, and so on? And the second question is, how are they doing that? And a part of that second question is what the interactivity has to do with it. What's different about digital games? Because they involve the player. The player has some role in the experience, which is very different from, say, an image, which is designed to be experienced a certain way, or indeed a text. So we're going to consider how these things are, how they're styled, how the form influences the content. And then the third question is all this actually good or not? From the point of view of us as scholars and students who are interested in the real antiquity, should these often quite loose interpretations in new media for audiences who are not specialists, should that be encouraged? Is it always good? Or are there some forms of it that are bad? Bad for the discipline and bad for humanity? We shall find out. Oh, by the way, this presentation will include a disaster for humanity within a certain game, which is gory in the sense that it's got some gruesome zombies in it. So if that bothers you at all, then you have to shut your eyes, but you will have to hear them groaning. Okay, on we go. So the first game I'm going to look at is Kid Icarus. I just heard a shout out there. 1986, before most of you were thought of. This is when perhaps the most famous game with classical content reached a mass audience. And this was a game called Kid Icarus. This is, by the way, a very slow frame rate GIF. The game itself is much smoother than this. Just to give you an idea of what it's like to play. Kid Icarus is interesting and exceptional for 2 reasons. First of all, the way that it was marketed, even the name Kid Icarus, has very little to do with the way that it was intended to be experienced. And secondly, it's from Japan. It was actually originally designed and made in Japan for Japanese players, and it was only in 1987 that it reached the North American and European audiences. So it began in Japanese for Japanese players, and that's interesting for us because it's all about Greek myth. I'm going to show you just a few sprites from the game. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but here are the names of the characters, which are transliterated from Japanese, and some images to show you what they look like. I've selected a few here. I didn't take every single one. But just to give you a flavour here, there's a thing which you encounter, an enemy, which is called Tros, and there's another one called Ganymede. Now, what we have to do here is think, how was this arrived at when the English transliterator looked at the Japanese? And clearly, this is the name Ganymede. If you look at the Japanese, it's actually stressed the central syllable there, Ganymede. Ganu represents the Greek letter upsilon. So in fact, it's not taken from English or American English, it's actually taken from the Greek. It's from probably a Japanese person's scholarly or otherwise reading about Greek myth, and it's been transliterated from the Greek. Okay, we have twin bellows, huge roar, Minos or Minos, Pluton, Daphne, Erinus, various other things. And then these three on the right are the main characters. Pit, that's your protagonist. You are Pit, the hero. Medusa is the end boss, the ultimate enemy. This is her human form. After that, she turns into a big monster with one eye. And this is the one that you're trying to rescue. This is the princess, the damsel in distress, as was typical for platform games in that era. So there's a little bit of Super Mario behind this setup. Pit is going to rescue Palutena, which, by the way, in the 2012 remake, Kid Icarus Uprising, we find it pronounced Palutina. I'm going to come back to the pronunciation in a minute. But I just want you to look at these titles, and I'll tell you a few things about what these names mean. Daphne is a Greek word for laurel. It's the name of a plant. And if you've ever read Ovid's Metamorphoses, Daphne appears very early in the poem where Apollo is chasing her and she turns into something vegetal. She becomes the laurel tree. This enemy looks like a flower. So the designer has some Greek myth in mind. There's also Greek myth behind these names. Minos, King Minos, stepfather of the Minotaur. Tros and Ganymede, they don't really make any sense looking at the monsters themselves, but they actually do make a pair. Tros, mythologically, was the father of Ganymede. So the designer has decided to use those two names, and they appear to be linked, if not meaningful, within the design of these enemies, and so on. Erinus is an Erinus, the Greek word for a fury, otherwise known as the Eumenides. Okay, I'm narrating too much here. Just to sum up here, Pit, Medusa, Palutina. There are some disconnected bits of Greek mythological content here in the form of the names. Some of it looks like monster names that have been mistransliterated by the English authors here. Hydro, in the Japanese, is Hydra, which is actually Hydra. So this is based on the monster, Hydra. And then Twin Bellows, in Japanese, is Twinberusu, which is a version of the name Cerberus, but it's Twinberus because it's got two heads instead of three. And finally, Palutina, probably in Japanese, being pronounced Palutina, is actually Parthena. And Parthena is an epithet of the goddess Athena. She's sometimes called Athena Parthena, meaning the maiden. And that's why in Greece, that big temple dedicated to Athena is called the Parthenon, because it's Athena Parthena. So Palutina, as she's now called, was originally Palutina, and before that, Parthena. So it's an epithet for the goddess Athena. Athena, Medusa, and a hero all belong together in one narrative in Greek myth, and that's not the story of Icarus at all. So he should really be called Kid Perseus, because that's the origin myth. And as you play, you go through an underworld, you go past Twin Bellows, or Twin Bellows, you go over the overworld, and then you go up through the clouds, and you finally meet your enemy, who has usurped Palutina. She's taken the place of the goddess, and that is, of course, Olympus up in the clouds. So those three sections correspond to a Greek mythological world. But none of that really comes through in the English translation because the translator isn't privy to that plan. So it's become something rather different. Oh, one last thing to say about this, and I've spent much longer on this than I planned to, but it's hopefully interesting. A two-headed dog monster and a sort of a swarthy-looking man with two little horns might put you back in the earlier 80s if you're thinking about cinema, because there is a story about Perseus in the 80s in film, which was known worldwide, and that was the original Clash of the Titans. That's 1981. And anybody who's seen that might know there's a bad guy in that called Calibos, and he's a Greek kind of version of Caliban from Shakespeare's The Tempest. But Calibos has two little pointy horns. And this guy here, Pluton, actually puts me in mind of Calibos, but maybe I'm reading too much into it. Certainly there is a two-headed dog, which is an enemy that Perseus has to fight. And only in that movie. That's not from Greek myth. So moving on to a different example entirely. This one isn't massively different. I'll give you, it's another Japanese game for Japanese audiences only. Of the 5 games in this franchise, Glory of Heracles no Eiku, you went from the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Famicom, here and here, and to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, here and here, and then finally Nintendo Double Screen in 2008. Only the last one actually was sold in Europe and North America. The others were all internal for Japanese audiences. But think of that, a 4-part franchise, all about Hercules, that was never known outside Japan. So Kid Icarus is not at all unique, but there's clearly an abiding interest in antiquity in digital games in Japan, even as far as back as the 80s. So here's something rather different. I've talked about platformers and RPGs, and now I'm going to talk about role-playing games, by the way, and I'm going to talk about strategy games now. Very different audience, a very different experience for the gamer. It's something you spend a lot more time on. It's not the arcade-style short game, then you die. This is for longer-term play, especially enabled by domestic game platforms, and especially the PC. And here's just 2 examples. On the left, Sid Meier's Civilization. This is the first game in the series, 1991. It's still going strong. Civilization 6 came out this past year, and is still receiving updates. And on the right is something more specific, not just ancient cultures of all kinds, but one in particular, the Romans, and the game Praetorians, 2003. One of them is turn-based, the other one is real-time, but they're both forms of strategy game which are, in some ways, a deeper experience because they're designed for longer-term play. And the reason why I'd like to contrast that with the other 2 that we just saw is not only because one's Greek and one's Roman, and one's Japanese and one's Western in origin, but because this one is characterized by an attempt to recreate history. When you look at mythology, of course, your inspiration is different. The experience that it promises is different. And the thing about more historical games, and in particular military and urban games like Praetorians and to some extent Civilization, is that people who play them actually get the game marketed to them as something authentic, something that is a reconstruction, an experience of the past. Inevitably, it's going to be a certain view of that. But this is going to be important as we go on, because these 2 things have blurred together a little bit in recent times. And I think it's really important to remember that none of these games are designed for academic audiences, or indeed primarily aimed at people with a classical education who have read about Greek myth or read about Roman history. Therefore, a much broader audience who will actually, to some extent, have their experience of those things, their impressions, shaped by playing the game. The game actually comes before any kind of formal study, which emphasizes their importance in the modern world, and also perhaps some of the responsibility that they bear, along with TV and movies and other mass media, in shaping people's perceptions and their preconceptions. And then another franchise, perhaps better known and more recent, Rome Total War, and its sequel, Total War Rome 2, which wasn't massively commercially successful. It had certain technical problems for a start. But this was a combination of real-time and turn-based, and really quite in-depth, quite a complex game with a lengthy campaign element. So people play these games partly to witness and experience the history that they may know about or want to know about, but also to have a hand in reconstructing that history or even changing it. And there's something fundamental about the game experience, which is that it has to be somewhat open-ended. It has to be a challenge which is either met or not met, an outcome which is in question. And that's quite different from our view of the past, which is a closed book. Things are, it's not such an emphasis on getting at the truth, but getting at some potential or even playing with reality. And that's true of all games, but historical games in particular. And I'm just giving you this example to show another very mainstream view of ancient Rome. This was much more action-oriented, kind of an over-the-shoulder melee combat game. And I mentioned it because in 2013 it was one of the handful of launch titles for the new generation Xbox. And the way that Rome is presented there is very different from the Roman Praetorians, and this is because of the game genre. The very nature of play requires certain types of experience. So if you do look at digital games as a medium and find out how classical antiquity is being claimed there, then you have to know something about game design, even the fundamentals of it, what the game genres actually mean, what established conventions there are. Okay, now I'm going to move on to a different genre again. This is going to be my last one. I'm going to talk about first-person shooters. Not a genre usually associated with the past. The kind of thing where you're going around, this is an over-the-shoulder view game, but most of them are first-person. So you're within an environment, you have enemies, you're aiming at them, you're usually looking at them through the sights of a weapon. Here's a pair of games, one of which is presenting a place which isn't real. This is an unnamed Spanish-Roman town from Resident Evil 4, but it's in terms of the game, it's supposed to be a real place. And if we compare this with another game from a couple of years later, in fact, Medal of Honor Airborne drops you during the Second World War into an archaeological site, which is a real one. This is the two temples at Paestum, and you actually end up going into a dig in amongst the boxes and the trowels and everything as you fight Nazis in a historical setting. So it's supposed to be, and by the way, there is some historical basis for this. It was the theatre of war, but you're certainly immersed in it very fully. And so I think the aesthetic appeal here could be similar, except that one is imagined and the other one is actually notionally real. And here's another pair which is kind of similar. Pompeii during the eruption is another good place to shoot people. This example on the left is in some kind of imagined hell. It's a fantasy place, but it clearly resembles a real Pompeii because of the classical architecture, sculptures, and to some extent the enemies. There are gladiator-type enemies around. And on the other side is Darkest of Days, perhaps one of the darkest of days for the first-person shooter genre, because it's a really broken game. You will not find positive reviews of it, but you see yourself in a time travel setting. So here, in the fiction of the game, you're in real history, and that must be to some extent the appeal. And that's why you see ancient enemies with swords and arrows, but long weapons, and that's why you're able to mix things up in a slightly fantastical way there. Okay, this is the point where I want to talk about a more recent game. 2018, Call of Duty Black Ops 4. It had a storyline in it which involved kind of supernatural time travel theme again. This is a screenshot from the part of the game called 9, or IX, and in it you find yourself fighting zombies in ancient Rome. And it's heavily fantasized. You can see from the coloration and the aesthetics of it. You might see some strange sights in the corners of this screenshot. There are zombies, there are gladiators, there are tigers, there are zombie gladiators, and there are zombie tigers. It's very lurid and exciting, but there's a lot of research here in order to build a specific fantasy, a type of fantasy experience which has some kind of USP, some unique selling point, and that is its location in the past. This is Scarlet. Her father is missing, she's looking for him. This means that she wants to go back in the past. If this guy looks like Hollywood actor Liev Schreiber, that's because it is him.
is. After all, he knows where we're going.
He's not that big in real life. This is the magic of video games.
Behold the great and mighty city of Delphi.
I thought Delphi was the city above ground.
Red herring. The one up there was a decoy intended to protect the real Delphi from its enemies.
Please help me. I am trapped in the temple of Apollo. These ropes we're not the first ones in here. Let's take this nice and easy.
So these are ancient Greeks. They're quite well preserved, actually.
The unclean wretches have tormented me for centuries.
Look, I know coming here was my idea and all, but I'm starting to have some second thoughts. Third, even.
Just face death, or could possibly scare you more. Know thyself. I hope you know what you're doing, Scarlet.
I love self-translating inscriptions. Make life very easy. So this appears to be the oracle at Delphi.
Where is my father? Where is Alastair Rhodes? Just like your father, I too am a prisoner. These bonds prevent me from freeing him. Please, I beg of you, set us free.
And they're off. Okay, so that's clearly very heavily fantasized, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't say for certain that there are no zombies in archaeological sites, but I'm pretty sure that this is a Victorian nostalgia-flavoured view of an era, a bygone era of archaeology, when people's personal missions to learn things, but also to obtain things, to loot the sites and so on, might inspire this kind of narrative of people who have come together as a motley crew in order to further individual agendas. And of course you have a heroine who's looking for a lost father. Now, this particular take on antiquity, rather interestingly, falls inside a game franchise, Black Ops, which is modern in setting. This part of Black Ops 4 has a past setting, and it's a bit of a departure for the series. But you're still, most of the action is through the barrel of a gun, and I think the experience for the player is simply deepened by the specific interest of the ancient setting, and the plot is priming them to experience the game a certain way, and the plot doesn't always have a direct bearing on the gameplay, but I think it's surprising to see not only how far the technology has come, but also how far audiences' expectations have come, how perhaps the ambitions of game designers have come quite far as well. So I'm going to finish by talking about the present and the future of digital games as an industry, as a cultural phenomenon, and as an access point to antiquity. And I'm going to suggest that there are three problems, three big risks from the point of view of someone studying the past about what games might do. They can privilege a certain perspective on the past, and you might call that perspective literature. Written texts generally come to us from the elite. It's not a very diverse group of people. They're usually male, they're usually ethnically Roman, or not always. I mean, there is quite a bit of diversity, especially into the Roman Empire, but in general, ancient texts come to us from the educated minority, and that tends to be the type of thing which furnishes narratives. So that's what games designers are going to latch onto. The second problem might be not valuing the subject and relying on the tropes of games. In other words, you slap a Roman or Greek setting onto it, but it's basically the same as any other first-person shooter or role-playing game. Not sort of the opportunity of something specific, I suppose something researched, has not been taken up. And then the third problem, which is different from that, would be not valuing what games can do and relying on the tropes of the past in other media. And I suppose, in a way, Kid Icarus is like that. It's simply taken some impressions from a film and then transferred them into a game. And that's actually very common in a new medium. And this is one of the newest. So there are very interesting specific game franchises which have no connection to other media. For example, the one on my title slide, a game called Apotheon, which was cut from whole cloth apart from the classical sources that are quoted in it. But using tropes is inevitable in any kind of large budget mass media means of presenting stories, because there is so much risk that originality can be a problem. So you need to guarantee a certain amount of return, you need to guarantee that people get what they expect. And so that can have a limiting effect. You end up with, as I said, with tropes being recycled. And I'm going to wrap up with two bits of information. One is a quotation from a man called Salvatore Settis from a book called The Future of the Classical, which is something that's very relevant to the theme of claiming the classical. And he was already well into his 60s by the time he wrote this, so I don't think he's a gamer, but what he says applies to games as well as to other media. I'll just read it out. When we use classical culture in a vague and uncultured manner, we tend to put that culture on an unreachable pedestal and deprive it of its historical context. In other words, praising something in a vague way can cause it to be overvalued for your purposes. This in turn projects it onto a universal plane, the classical, as a good thing, and in practice turns it into the weapon used with a degree of concealment by Western civilization to claim its superiority over other civilizations. So when people talk about how great classical antiquity is, by comparison with other cultures, in general, they're not focusing very specifically on it. They're taking, as I said, tropes. And this is something that any intellectual or any opinion holder can do. It doesn't have to be in one particular medium. It doesn't have to be a person who's designing or developing a game, or even a player. This is something that we all have to be careful with. And the last piece of information I'll give you is that there are people starting to study digital games in a very critical way, and there isn't that much going. The bibliography is still small, but it is growing rapidly, and that's because I think of people like you who are coming up with digital games as part of their experience, something that they are experienced in, knowledgeable about, and interested in. And when you find presentations of a subject in your medium that you're familiar with, but you also can step back and see it as an academic subject as well, then you're able to see the medium itself as an academic subject, and that's starting to happen. A couple of recent examples. Classics for All was an edited volume in 2009. It had 2 chapters on video games. The book next to it was all about computer games in antiquity, Greek and Roman games in the computer age. It was based on a conference. And then the cover on the right, and they've used the same game as me to get their title image, edited by Christian Rollinger, a book from Bloomsbury, which is coming out, I think, later this year, called Classical Antiquity in Video Games, Playing with the Ancient World. And I have talked about a few examples of that very thing, games that play with the ancient world for various different agendas, some for attempting to reconstruct the past, and some for reinventing it. And a game franchise which is perhaps large and deep enough to do both at once is Assassin's Creed. final show of hands, how many of you have ever played an Assassin's Creed game? At least half the people in the room. The two on the screen are the last two. Assassin's Creed Origins, set in 1st century BC Egypt, the world of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. And the one on the right is Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is set during the Peloponnesian War. And as you play, you can choose whether you want to follow the Athenian or the Spartan storyline. But either way, you are an assassin in the past, and a great deal of content is derived from research. I'd even say academic research, as well as from fantasy. They're a blend of the two. And something that's only been done with these two, and none of the previous games in this long-running franchise, is the creation of a discovery mode, a form of play which doesn't involve any assassinations. It doesn't involve any particular interactions except for discovery. And what you're given is a theme to learn about, and then you're given an itinerary, and you explore in the game, and you're presented with information. They're designed for learning, and they've even, in some cases, been used for academic and school purposes. So perhaps games can be teaching tools, and that may be in the near future. But that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening.